I'm really delighted to have all of our discussants today with us, going in the order that I see them. Anand Taneja, SherAli, Tareen, who will be moderating the discussion, Rosemary Corbett, co-editor with me of the volume, Kelly Pemberton, and Anna Bigelow. Thank you all. I also want to thank the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life at Columbia University, where this book kind of initially took shape through the generosity of a loose grant. So I also want to thank Toby Volkman, who of the Luce Foundation, for making this work possible. It's also sponsored by the South Asia Institute, the Middle East Institute, and the Department of Anthropology at Columbia. And with that, I will turn it over to SherAli, since I'm going to be playing a different role later. So thank you, Sher.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Kathy, and thank you to Mariana, Walid, and everyone else at Columbia for this invitation. I'm looking forward.
Can I interrupt for a second? I also meant to thank, from the bottom of my heart, the people at IRCPL, Matthew Engelke, Walid, Mariana Procaro, and Madeline Tegesis. So thank you for reminding me.
Absolutely. Well, we are all gathered here today to engage, debate, discuss, dissect, and most of all, celebrate a very important and landmark publication in the fields of religious studies, South Asian studies, Islamic studies, and really the study of religion, anthropology, more broadly speaking, modern Sufis in the state, the politics of Islam in South Asia and beyond, co-edited by Katherine, Pratt, Ewing, and Rosemary Corbett. And to do so, we have with us a star-studded panel whose own work intersects with this book in very serious and interesting ways, and I will introduce them briefly as the conversation goes on. But I just wanted to set the stage in less than 5 minutes. Our panelists will go more into the details of the book. The key theme of this book, as I read it, really surrounds a certain kind of a discourse around a very important tradition within Islam, that of Sufism, oftentimes translated as the Islamic mystical tradition. And this book really is a critique of this dominant and to this day very popular way of looking at Sufism as the other of either fundamentalist Islam, Salafism, or the other of legal Islam or Sharia, etc. And it really is a critique of these moderating discourses around Sufism and the ways in which it gets implicated in various kinds of state, non-state political discourses and operations. Edited volumes are notoriously difficult, both logistically, in terms of getting people together and getting them to write excellent chapters, and also in terms of their conceptual coherence. But when they're done really well, they can be extremely useful, extremely brilliant, and a great treat and gift for everyone interested and involved. And this volume really is one of those volumes that really is the best of an edited volume, which brings together a star-studded cast of authors and scholars in different disciplines at different career stages, who have really done micro studies, playing to their strengths to examine this very important tradition within Islam, and with a focus on South Asia, but not exclusively focused on South Asia. We have 2 excellent chapters in the volume, one by Rosemary, another by Professor Weir, that focuses on the context of the US and Indonesia. I think when I reread this book in preparation for this event today, I think the key strength of this book, to put it very briefly, is that it really operates on multiple layers. It has a philosophical layer in terms of talking about traditions of transcendentalism, perennialist philosophy that undergirds these stereotypes about Sufism. It talks about state policies and discourses both in India and in Pakistan, and how they have been implicated in the tradition of Sufism and how it's been translated and cast. It talks about religious thought and discourses that range from complex texts and to qawwali in Indian cinema. And then, of course, it has a focus and a very strong focus on the everyday shrine practices and the intra-Muslim sort of contestations, complexities, and debate. So these multiple layers really coalesce in really nice ways and in very coherent ways. And that, I think, is the key strength of this book, in that it is talking about a much larger phenomenon, that of state and non-state regulation of a very important tradition, but it is doing so through these very carefully crafted micro studies. And kudos to Columbia Press for publishing this as a reasonably affordable paperback. I think this will really work remarkably well for all those instructors watching this in undergraduate and even graduate courses in different moments of an Islam class or an anthropology of religion class, and so on. So without further ado, I want to turn to our panelists for today. And I believe Marianne in the chat has given a, we'll keep on giving the formal written versions of their biographies. I'll just focus on a couple of key themes from their bios as I introduce them. So our first speaker is Professor Anand Vivek Taneja, who is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies and Anthropology at Vanderbilt University. And he is the author of the wonderfully titled book, Jinneology, Time, Islam, and Ecological Thought in the Medieval Ruins of Delhi, published by Stanford University Press, I believe in 2017, if my memory serves me correct. Anand, over to you. And each panelist, sorry, just to give you the rules, will talk for 10 to 12 minutes, everyone. And then we will open it up for discussion. So audience members, please keep thinking of discussion points, questions. Please don't feel shy to type your questions. You will have to type your questions in the chat box with this webinar format. So please start thinking of your questions as people are speaking. It's a bit ironic. My own contribution in this volume is a critique of the idea of moderation as a discourse, but I'm the moderator here. But we'll follow a pre-modern notion of moderation to do with justice and balance, rather than one that is implicated with the nefarious politics of the modern state. Over to you, Anand, please. Thank you.
Thank you, SherAli. I look forward to your pre-modern moderation. And thank you, Kathy and Rosemary, for putting together this wonderful book, for inviting me to the original workshop that was the genesis of this volume back in 2015, and for giving me an opportunity to engage with this volume again today. I also want to say that the vision that animated the workshop and this volume are exemplary to me of what ethical academic practice can look like while being embroiled, as we all are, in the political economy of research funding. As Rosemary Corbett notes in her concluding remarks, the directors of the workshop that led to this volume were initially tasked by foundation officers with gathering together scholars who could demonstrate the utility of Sufi traditions in producing modern liberal democratic publics. Instead, this volume brings together scholars who rigorously dismantle the concatenation of binaries which underlie much funding in the study of Islam, as well as American foreign policy initiatives. Good Muslim versus bad Muslim, Sufi versus Deobandi, mystical heterodox Islam versus political orthodox Islam. Rather than fulfilling a funding agenda then, this volume instead turns the analytic lens back, especially in the chapters by Rosemary Corbett and Verena Meyer, to the politics of knowledge production by funding agencies in the North Atlantic and their relation to foreign policy in the post-Second World War era, which has been instrumental in the production of these binaries, which have subsequently taken on a new life in the politics of post-colonial nation states such as Indonesia, India, and Pakistan, especially after 9/11 and the global war on terror. In my comments today, I want to return to the explicitly political question that the workshop on rethinking Islam, democracy, and identity was funded through, and which it problematizes. In Kathy Ewing's phrasing, this question is, how can scholars contribute to the making of Muslims and the nations to which they belong into modern global citizens? All of the work in this volume, especially in the aftermath of the spectacular failure of American state building in Afghanistan, makes it clear that the question is a deeply flawed one which brings to mind Munir Niazi's sher, one brilliantly deployed by Shahab Ahmed in What is Islam? Kisi ko apne amal ka hisab kya dete? Sawal sare galat the, jawab kya dete? What account could I give of my acts? The questions were all wrong. What answers could I give? Based on my earlier research on a saint shrine in Delhi, and on my current research on Muslim engagements with pluralism and democratic politics in a Hindu majoritarian India, and on the insights of this volume, I want to propose, if not a different question, a different programmatic statement. Bearing witness to actual Muslim engagements with democracy, with pluralism, and with the state and to the political theologies which inform such engagement, challenges not only our notion of the possibilities of Muslim politics or the limits of the Islamic discursive tradition, but also the taken for granted certitudes of a modern liberal secular politics, which, to quote SherAli Tareen's commentary, needs to tame and regulate religion so that it is rendered amenable to the protocols and expectations of liberal secular reason. To be able to bear such witness, of course, requires work such as this volume accomplishes, demolishing inherited categories of knowledge while being aware of the structures of power that undergird them. In that spirit, I want to ask a question that this volume tells us is not self-evident. What is Sufism? In her article on Sufis and politics in Pakistan, Alex Philippon writes of Sufism as a reservoir of symbolic resources and identity reference, one which has long been the locus of debate between competing groups within the public sphere. I want to pick two drops from this bottomless reservoir, as it were, to think with. One is the concept of vilayat, and the other is the idea of tasawwuf, or Sufism, as it is expressed in contemporary Urdu poetry in India. The idea of Sufi vilayat, one which has long antecedents in Muslim discourse as articulated by the work of Muzaffar Alam, Vincent Cornell, and Simon Digby, among others, has long been a political one, implying that true sovereignty over a particular territory belongs not to the temporal ruler, but to the Sufi saint or wali, friend of God, settled in that territory. This vilayat, manifested often through miraculous interventions, means that the moral order is upheld by the Sufi saint to which the temporal authority of the time is subservient. In his Languages of Political Islam, Muzaffar Alam has explored at great length what this idea meant for the political theory and practice of pre-modern Muslim kingship in South Asia. In the post-colonial context, the idea of vilayat has continued to challenge the authority of the post-colonial nation state and hold open alternate forms of authority and justice, memory and belonging, or in Carla Bellamy's memorable phrasing, a powerful counterculture, where petitioners become citizens of an alternate kingdom, where by the grace of the saint, they have overcome the discourses of religious difference that have tragically divided neighborhoods, communities, and the subcontinent itself. In my book, Genealogy, Time, Islam, and Ecological Thought in the Medieval Ruins of Delhi, I look at the complex ways in which the culture of a dargah of jinn saints in the ruins of a 14th century palace complex holds open potentials for memory, healing, and justice for the subaltern populations who flock to the shrine, potentials that are otherwise foreclosed by the cultivated amnesias and bureaucratic procedures of the post-colonial, post-partition Indian state. In Bollywood films too, as in the very, very popular Bajrangi Bhaijaan, the vilayat of the saints, especially that of Nizamuddin Aulia of Delhi, and the links between the different Sufi shrines of the subcontinent across the India-Pakistan border become the motive force of the story, which repeatedly questions the naturalization of this border. The vilayat of the saints does not only promote the rhetoric of national integration and Indian pluralism, as Rachna Rao Umashankar notes in the case of Bollywood Qawwalis, but at least in this film, distinctly unsettles it. It is the continuing power of the vilayat of the saints, coupled with their real material power as landholders, that have made Sufi Peers such an integral part of Sindhi politics, as Sara Ansari notes in her chapter in this volume. However, both the Pakistani and Indian states have tried to folklorize the enduring power of Sufi vilayat, as Alex Philippon notes, as a harmless and apolitical cultural patrimony that could help legitimize the authority of the state, which is exactly the opposite of the alternate moral order that Sufi vilayat has signified in pre-modern, as well as post-colonial political thought and popular practice. I want to turn here, speaking of things that are thought of as apolitical cultural patrimony, I want to turn to another aspect of Muslim life deeply linked with Sufism, which is poetry, ghazal poetry in particular, or shairi. As Kathy Ewing notes in her introduction, her interlocutors in Pakistan in the 1980s associated Sufism with poets such as Shah Abdul Latif Bhitai and Bulle Shah, rather than with local peers or shrines. As Brian Bond notes in his article on the lives of a fatwa against musical performance in Kutch, Sindhi Sufi poetry is an affectively potent and deeply localized form of engagement with the Islamic discursive tradition. Poetry performance, both sung and recited, thus function as a form of Islamic pedagogy that imparts knowledge of how one should conduct oneself in the world and what sort of relationship one should aim to cultivate with God. Bond's description of Sindhi Sufi poetry is, I would argue, applicable to much of Urdu poetry in the ghazal tradition, which is centrally concerned with how to be a self in relation to an other in the multivalent language of this poetry being dependent on the context, a hostile neighbor, an earthly beloved, or that most beloved friend of all, referred to by the Sufis only as Yar. So much so, that Ghalib, the most canonical of Urdu poets, could say of his own poetry, "Ye masail tasawwuf, ye tera kalam Ghalib, tujhe hum wali samajhte, jo na bada khwah hota." These matters of Sufism, this discourse of yours, Ghalib, we would consider you a saint if you weren't a wine drinker. I quote Ghalib here because, and he's relevant to what I'm trying to say, because in my ethnographic experience, working with Muslims in contemporary India, poetry is the most universal of Muslim discourses or of Islamic discourses. It is the medium in which Muslims across all kinds of differences, sectarian, class, and gender, among others, can express and understand each other's affective states and ethical stances. And here I want to give an experience of what this. Can I take 2 more minutes, SherAli?
Yeah, you have time. You have 2 minutes.
Yeah. I want to give an anecdote about the evening of March 12, 2018, in South Delhi's City Fort Auditorium. Ustad Iqbal Ahmad Khan, who has since passed away, a prominent musician of the Delhi Gharana, was staging a narrative of Mirza Ghalib's life. And before much of the program began, he came on stage and claimed that Ghalib was a Sufi of the Nizami Silsila, and then he recited this above couplet, "Ye misail tasawwuf, ye tera kalam Ghalib." And contra Ghalib said, "But we consider him a saint anyway. Hum log to wali samajhte hi hain." The audience's reaction was slow and uncertain because at least since the late 1980s, in Indian popular culture, Ghalib has been portrayed as a figure who chooses to be outside the sphere of religion. Among many contemporary Muslims and in the academic study of Islam and Muslim societies, poets and poetry have often been understood as being distinct from and standing apart from the larger Islamic discursive tradition. To publicly claim Ghalib as a Muslim saint, as Ustad Iqbal Ahmad Khan did, is to trouble the assumed boundary between poetry and piety, a troubling shared by the work of this volume. What might be at stake in troubling this boundary in contemporary India? To declare Ghalib as a Muslim saint at a moment when Muslims are being so widely demonized in India that there are no good Muslims left in public discourse is, of course, a political act. It is especially relevant at a time when Azadi, freedom, a term central to the Kashmiri struggle for self-determination, has become a non-sectarian chant against the authoritarian politics of the Hindutva regime. To quote from the conclusion of a paper I recently published, Ghalib, for those who are rediscovering him in contemporary India, holds open the potentials for the exaltation of the self, the questioning of convention, and of radical freedom of Azadi from authoritarianism and restrictive social mores. In the last few years, when I have visited Ghalib's mazar, I have found it covered with flowers and chadars like those offered at the shrines of Sufi saints. To understand Ghalib as a Muslim saint at this historical moment is, I argue, a rebroadening of the Islamic tradition, its reclaiming of the tradition's critical edge. To insist that Ghalib is a Sufi and a saint is to insist that the lifeways he embodied, in the senses of an attitude of openness towards radical religious difference, as well as embodying a spirit of defiant philosophical inquiry, is Islamically legitimate and authoritative. And it is to insist that this Islam, which embodies such open disdain of worldly power and embodies such an elevation of the self, bandagi mein bhi wo azada ho, wo khud bhi hai ki hum, to quote Ghalib, where he says that even in servitude, we are so free and self-regarding, is particularly relevant at a time when Muslims in India are assailed by majoritarian Hindutva and its drive to crush and eliminate minority and dissenting voices. It also confronts us with the radical possibility that what Sabah Mahmood characterizes as secularity, as a substrate of ethical sensibilities, attitudes, and dispositions, which allow an individual to live comfortably and even hospitably with religious difference without privileging the agency of the state, can be religious, particularly Islamic, in its origins. Such thoughts become possible, of course, only through the rethinking that volumes such as this one provide. And for that, I am again grateful to Kathy and Rosemary and everyone in the volume and the workshop, and of course, on this panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anand. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Professor Anna Bigelow, who is Associate Professor of Islamic Studies at the Department of Religious Studies at Stanford University. Most recently, Anna is the editor of a brand new volume on material objects in Islamic cultures called Islam Through Objects, published by Bloomsbury in 2021. Her earlier book called Sharing the Sacred, Practicing Pluralism in Muslim North India was published by Oxford University Press in 2010. Anna, over to you.
Thank you so much, SherAli. It's wonderful to see everybody. It feels like a mini reunion, especially in the absence of some of our typical conference gatherings. So I very much appreciate that Kathy and Rosemary made this possible for us. So thank you for persisting in spite of all of the challenges of the times. So I am very grateful that I was asked to engage with this book. It's been a delight to read and to both find myself resistant to and also excited by many of the interventions that the various authors are making. And as I open my comments here, I promised that Anand and I did not coordinate in advance, that we would use poetic interventions as our way into our engagement with the book. But as I was reading this, of course, the poet and philosopher thinker that was quite often invoked in many of the essays in the book is Muhammad Iqbal, whose 1907 ghazal, again, a genre that I think perhaps particularly suits itself for some of the kinds of engagements that are being discussed here. One of his most famous works came out in 1907, in which he's deploring, as he does in many of his works, the current state of Muslims in India that is colonized by the British. And by extension, he deplores the state of Muslims around the world whose minds, if not also their bodies, were also colonized by materialism, by atheism, by a sense of inferiority that they've internalized in the face of hegemonic European modernity. And so many of both Ewing and Corbett and many other essays are engaging with some of these conversations and their knock-on effects. But among the couplets in this particular ghazal are the following, and I won't try to bring you the Urdu in my terrible accent. But in translation, he's indicting those who live in the West, the Diyar-e-Maghrib, saying that, "O dwellers in the West, God's world is not a shop. What you consider genuine will be regarded as false. Your civilization will die by its own blade. A nest built on a weak branch will not endure." So this whole composition, and this is just a small piece of it, is widely regarded as being prophetic, as seeing the eventual downfall of Western categories and assumptions and colonialism and imperialism and materialism, that this will come in various ways. And one might almost imagine that Iqbal recognized the ways in the people of the Euro-American Maghrib would not only exploit and extract materially from the people and the regions of Islam, but would also come to plunder Islam itself for a utilitarian, self-interested ends. But as Iqbal points out, such a nest is precarious. It is built on unsubstantial supports. And I think this volume does a lot of very important work, not just the necessary labor of exposing the rot in the whole, in the tree that is supporting such initiatives, but also in building a genuine understanding on a more solid foundation. And so I'll stop trying to draw this metaphor out any further, though believe me, I actually tried to structure my entire response through the ghazal, but that would probably become a little ponderous at a certain point. It certainly did in my ears. So one of the most clear offerings that the volume brings us is an indictment of the instrumentalization of Sufism and its operationalization to be deployed as a category to further particular Orientalist, neoliberal, or politically secular purposes. And so all these chapters are indicating the various ways in which the category of Sufi has been appropriated and misused in these ways. And these essays all show various types of resistance to these projects and also demonstrate ways in which these categorical assumptions have shaped Sufi communities themselves and the conditions in which they are functioning today. So the chapters disrupt easy narratives, and as SherAli pointed out in his response in the book, they make complicated constructs unavailable for generalized narratives. And I think this is one of those points where those of us in the humanities often rub up against those of us in the more quantitative social sciences who want to create universals, who want to be able to extrapolate and generate policy diktats on the basis of particular examples. And many of us in our humanistic and qualitative social sciences are looking to complicate, to particularize, and to really understand something that from which you can't necessarily extrapolate universally applicable values. And I vividly remember when I was working on my dissertation project on that became the book that SherAli mentioned, Sharing the Sacred, I was asked by many people, so what are the 5 reasons why this town is so peaceful and gets along and everybody enjoys each other? And it would just make me feel like pulling my hair out, because this is not the question that anybody who'd actually engage with a study of the complicated, laborious, and concerted ways in which the care and feeding of any particular local comprehension or enactment of anything like Sufism or collective life is actually unfolds in a far less starkly utilitarian and functionalist way. And so I think this book is, all the chapters do amazing things with that. But so I've found myself asking, then what is this impulse or even compulsion to put the finger of the state or of the scholar on a scale to balance to shift the balance towards a version of Islam that is most conducive to particular notions of either pro-social collective life or positive internationalist belonging? So clearly we see here many of the ways in which those projects can go wrong, from perhaps Luce itself to Rockefeller Foundation and Corbett's work, and to the Ford Foundation, to the CVE, Countering Violent Extremism programs in the US, and the Sufi councils that are instituted in India and Pakistan. We see how these efforts not only produce skewed knowledge about how Muslims conceptualize or organize around complex manifestations of Sufism, but also how they become vectors of interpretation in relation to which Muslim South Asians are defining and locating themselves, and not just South Asians. This may seem to be a clear case of a doctrine of double effect, but one of the great contributions of this book is how clearly the intended effect, which theoretically should have a positive ethical motivation, that is supporting a particular form of palatable religion that's most compatible with the particular form of modernity, is just as ethically corrupt as all of those unintended outcomes, the double effects that are documented clearly here, the galvanizing effects on Barelvi militancy discussed by Philippon, the dissipation of and sort of diminution of Islam from filmic Sufism in service of a nostalgically nationalist pluralism posited by Umashankar, or the delegitimization of Sufi groups seen to be complicit in Rockefeller-funded projects, or the sectarianization of a shrine through government efforts to regulate sectarian interactions at Bibi Paktaman, as argued by Zaidi. So both the explicit goals of these efforts and their knock-on effects are revealing important and real investments in particular Sufi formations and the ways in which these Sufi actors and institutions confound, resist, engage, or ignore these interpretive investments. And I think we're being asked in reading this book to actually contemplate our own complicity, our own involvement in those initiatives. Even as we may be critiquing them, there are forms of replication that are that unfold at the same time. So, in looking at where we might go from here, and I think some of the important questions that are raised in this volume ask us to potentially consider, the trajectories offered by these essays provide crucial correctives, but are also really productive examples of scholarship that resist universalizing claims, insist on the value of the particular, and yet open directions for critical rather than facile comparison. For myself, as I'm particularly interested in how the study of contemporary Sufi life in India can unfold in conditions of precarity, violence, and state-sponsored discrimination, if not outright annihilation, this is a particularly important question for me to consider. So we may locate all kinds of unsatisfying collusions in the emic adoption of neoliberal, politically secular narratives around true Sufism or true Islam, but we also often see this being deployed as a survival strategy, and that as something that I think bears analysis. As Rachana pointed out in her essay, the cinematic performances of belonging are speaking both to a critique of the Indian nation's failure to keep its secular promises and to a still powerful imaginary of peaceful collective life, however distorted and nostalgic. So as an example of this, one of my interlocutors is a Bangalore-based Sufi poet and writer, Syed Liaquat Piran, and he frequently defines and explores and asserts the importance of secularism as the only assurance of peaceful society. In a work that he entitles Sufism, one of his essays, in one of the essays in the volume, he writes, quote, secularism and secular practices and propagation of secular values, human values, rational and scientific temper alone can bring communal harmony, peace, and tolerance. So he puts all of his stock in the ideals of an ostensibly, if completely failed and impoverished notion of secularism as it's actually executed in India today. But his assertions, which in that case were from 2016, could almost have been written in one of the prescriptive policy papers of the Rand Corporation, and there are limited and utilitarian understandings of how secularism will save the world from itself, and particularly from extremism, and of course particularly from Islamic extremism. But for Piran, he weaves it into an exposition on the life of Muhammad, a critique of government corruption, calls to revive the spiritual fabric of India, and poetry about God. His writings grapple with the rise of Hinduತ್ವ extremism and militancy, the erosion of trust in state institutions and corruption, and as ever, a nostalgic recall of a time when India's population, quote, coexisted with other religions with harmony and peace. And so I'm kind of poised about in this issue, and I found that as thinking about individuals like this and these kinds of projects in relation to the really important critiques that are being raised, what is the work that's being done here by these assertions and definitions and redefinitions of the secular, whether in particular media outlets or in the writings and compositions of those who are trying to claim space for something that is actually essential for their survival at this point in an India where the critiques of Muslim life are not without violence. So with my work, which is particularly attuned to ways in which Muslims and non-Muslims are producing imaginaries of collective life in and through co-presence in sacred spaces, I'm also finding it harder and harder in India today to imagine conversations with shrine visitors about religious others when minority life is so profoundly surveilled by majoritarian interests. And so I turn more and more, as SherAli pointed out, towards objects whose presence, manipulation, production, activation, deployment, evidence continuities and ruptures with the past and present, with the self and the other, as well as the possibilities of utopian imaginaries as forms of critique of oppressive realities. And I think looking at some of these discourses, many of which may be almost replicative of the very kinds of argumentation that is often critiqued in this volume, we're also seeing ways in which those are being deployed as forms of personal protection, as both a reminder of a value that they feel has been betrayed, and also as a claiming of protection against all of the erosion of safety, security, and identity that's unfolding in India. So, as you all know, of course, reviewing a edited volume or engaging in a discussion of an edited volume is almost always impossible because you want to mention everything and then go deeply into each particular piece. But so I thought, and I'm glad I think I picked up on the same tone that Anand started with, that mostly I found that all of these essays offered me lots of things to think about, not just in relation to my own work, but importantly in the way in which Islam in South Asia has been unfolded. So.
Thank you so much, Anna. And just a reminder for all audience members that please feel free to type your questions, comments. Doesn't have to be formally, nicely formulated. Please enter your thoughts in the chat box, and then we'll come to that when everyone has spoken. And the fuller versions of the bios of the panelists are in your chat. I'll be giving briefer introductions in the interest of time. So next we have Professor Kelly Pemberton, who is an associate professor of religion and women's gender and sexuality studies at the George Washington University. She's the author of Women Mystics and Sufi Shrines in India, published by University of South Carolina Press in 2010, and also the co-editor of the volume Shared Idioms, Sacred Symbols, and the Articulation of Identities in South Asia, published in 2009. Kelly, please. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, SherAli. And thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Rosemary. I very much enjoyed reading this volume. And thank you to everyone who helped organize this event. I'm glad I was able to participate after, after all, I think after a lot of back and forth, I wasn't sure that I'd be able to do this, but I'm glad that this worked out. So while I think in some cases I will not be able to speak as eloquently as some of my colleagues, for the simple reason that in many ways my work has, my recent research has moved me away from South Asia, though there are always still connections, including and especially to Sufism. I wanted to try to look at some of the ways in which the book dispels some common misperceptions and romanticisms about Sufis, both with respect to the individual chapters, or as many as I can incorporate into my discussion, and from my own personal experience researching both in India and Pakistan, and now in other countries. I joke sometimes with colleagues that I keep trying to get away from Sufism, but it keeps pulling me back in. And I find that even as I've been working on a book on gender activism in Muslim communities and Muslim majority countries around the world, as I come to Senegal, I find that it's impossible to write very much of anything about women in agriculture without dealing with Sufism. So always somehow Sufism beckons. There are 5 paradigms that I wanted to focus on, and these are paradigms, as I see it, that capture in the book, that capture some of the key ways in which Sufism has been addressed in scholarship. So I want to look at some of the ways in which some of the chapters unpack some of the contradictions inherent in these portraits, in these paradigms. The first is the Sufi imaginary. And by that, of course, I mean the landscape of meanings and significances, symbolisms and idioms that are attached to Sufism, both in its textual, scriptural on the one hand, and its lived on the other hand versions. And all of the chapters in one way or another touch on this. In particular, I want to look at or I want to say something about the trope of the peaceful, tolerant Sufi, who is embedded within the ranks of the masses, even as he or she, sometimes it is a she, stands above them in his or her spiritual prowess. There's obviously a romanticization inherent in portraits of Sufis such as this one. And I think the book is very effective both in evoking this misguided romanticization and in demonstrating an alternative imaginary that underscores what I see and what others I think have underscored as a two-way process of acculturation, whereby the idioms, meanings, symbols, significances, etc., of Sufism are spread outward, but also transformed in the process. And here I'm referring specifically to, or especially to, Sufi's engagement with Western political, intellectual, and secular circles. These, of course, are assessed in Rosemary Corbett's chapter on private foundations and their limited engagement with Sufis. I can say, the peaceful Sufi the Sufis as the peaceful Muslims paradigm is still very much alive and well. And both foundations and government agencies remain stubbornly resistant to challenging that paradigm, despite, I think, all of the evidence out there to the contrary. So, and the other thing that struck me about Rosemary's work, which I think very much applies to the study of Islam in general, is the reliance, and I think here the reference was particularly to the Rockefeller Foundation, the reliance on an insular network of scholars. In that case, it was an insular network of British and American scholars to shape funding programs. Again, it's still very much, I see, as someone who consults with government agencies, it's still very much, I think, a paradigm that prevails in both government agencies and in other type of organizations, nonprofit organizations that want to work in the Muslim world, particularly in Sufi communities. There's a tendency to speak to the same people, to rely on the same people all the time, and to ultimately ignore or leave out the voices of those who challenge these paradigms of Sufis as essentially tolerant, open-minded, peaceful, even of late feminists. Ideal partners in processes of modernization and secularization. Also, Verena Meyer's study of the relationship between Fazlur Rahman and Nurchol Majid, I probably mispronounced that name, underscores some of the ways in which such engagement with Western intellectual paradigms can and does often result in a synthesis of ideas that is then adapted to the local environment rather than being applied wholesale. Some would say that this kind of marriage of Western intellectual thought and Islamic history and tradition exemplifies the kind of modernism that ultimately in the late 19th century and early 20th century failed to inspire the masses and instead served to reinforce existing social hierarchies and cultural divisions. And of course, this is a topic that's evoked in Carla Bellamy's chapter on religious healing at the Santa Cruz Imambara in India. I'd love to see more studies of how this kind of engagement, particularly through digital technologies, continues to operate in that vein. And so I think the chapters in this book have given us a lot of material to work with, right, to push some of these conversations forward. The second paradigm is historical and intellectual currents in Sufism. There is a stubborn ignorance, I think, out there, whether it is deliberate or not, of the literature and intellectual traditions of Islam and Sufism that is still prevalent. These intellectual traditions, of course, demonstrate the complexities and have for a long time demonstrated the complexities of Sufi identities, identifications, practices, and of course, affiliations. A simple perusal of the Malfuzat, Maktubat, and hagiographic literature, especially the biographical dictionaries that emerged from South Asia, would yield many valuable insights into how Sufis themselves have for a long time denounced the outward ulama, right? This is one of the tropes you often see. And they contrast those with the inward walis, or the inward friends of God. These function more as didactic tropes in my understanding, rather than a blanket condemnation of ulama. The chapters by Usha Sanyal demonstrate this very well, these kinds of dichotomies and the use of, and how the use of language to condemn or to draw distinctions can shift and change over time. Of course, in her chapter, the religious elite of the Ahl Sunnat wa Jamaat, also known as the Barelvis, the Barelvi elite were both scholars of Islam and proponents of shrine-centered Sufism that foreground the kind of shrine-centered Sufism that foregrounds the importance of the Prophet Muhammad and his moral example, even as they underscore the importance of the charisma of the peer. Similarly, Brandon Ingram's chapter on the Taliban demonstrates that the boundaries that divide the Deobandis and the Barelvis are often more porous than their rhetoric would suggest. The third is Sufis and politics. Again, this trope of Sufis as being apolitical belies the ample evidence from textual sources that demonstrates otherwise. Verena Meyer and Marcia Hermanson's chapters, I think, illustrated these political entanglements very effectively. And to my thinking, these discussions of the complicated relationships between Sufis and politics, between Sufis and local politics, local politicians, between Sufis and questions of national identity, mirrored studies of Sufism in other country contexts where you can readily find these kinds of entanglements being discussed, I think, in fairly nuanced ways. This is especially true of studies of Sufism in North Africa and in West Africa, to a lesser extent in Sub-Saharan Africa, but also in countries like Turkey, where Ataturk, many, I think, people don't realize, had a, how would I describe it, an on and off again, an on again, off again relationship with the two Sufi tariqats, right? Ostensibly they were banned, but secretly they were allowed to operate and in some cases engage in very abusive behaviors. The adherents of some of the tariqats, particularly concerning young women who were members of the orders, as long as the leaders of these orders kept their followers in line. So even where outwardly there are, I think, common tropes of Sufis as being apolitical or as being divorced from politics, we find that under the surface, there are quite often very complicated entanglements between Sufis and, at least in local politics, right, between Sufi institutions and local politicians. The fourth is Sufi shrine cultures. Of course, these evoke questions of modernity. What do we make, as I think Helena Basu's chapter illustrates, of the attempts to merge the medical healing cultures at Sufi shrines and quote, modern psychiatric healing practices? We see in Carla Bellamy's chapter that these cooperations between shrine-centered practices of healing and Western concepts of medicine and healing come into open conflict. I had to wonder, as I was reading those two chapters, whether or not the attempts to merge traditional forms of healing, right, at these shrine and imambara, were in any way influenced by the World Health Organization study. I believe the year was 2002, in which they, and it was a global study, in which they encouraged multiple countries, governments of multiple countries around the world to do a better job of engaging traditional healers and integrating traditional forms of healing into the national healthcare systems. I know there were some initiatives in Pakistan. I don't know what the outcome ultimately of these was, but I really would love to see more work done in this vein. The other example that came to mind of a relatively successful endeavor in this regard was in Mali between Tuareg healers and NGOs that were offering medicines, vaccines, and other forms of medicines that were targeting women, that were targeting young women, young mothers. Finally, I would point to the paradigm that is not explicitly underscored or explicitly discussed in any of the chapters, but which is certainly touched on in Rachana Rao Umashankar's chapter on Bollywood's use of the Sufi trope, and that is the consumption model, right? Sufis, like Muslims around the world, are very much engaged in a marketplace of ideas and services. I think, for me, as I begin work on digital technologies and how these are transforming practices and beliefs in Islam and interactions between Muslims around the world, I think there is definitely a need to incorporate Sufis and Sufism into this discussion. In other words, how are Sufis using digital technologies to spread their message, to spread the influence of their orders around the world, or even to sell products and services? The only two that come to mind that I'm very familiar with are advertisements, one for videographers who film ceremonies, who film performances at Ur ceremonies, and what would you call them? I guess hotels, yeah. Places to stay should you come, for example, to Ajmer to attend the Urs of Muinuddin Chishti. I think there is a treasure trove of information and insights to be gleaned from the ways in which Sufis are participating in this marketplace, and how and whether the use of digital technologies is changing practices of Sufism, ideas about Sufism, and particularly the ideas about who is, as I think was posed at the outset of this panel, who is a Sufi, right? Who is authorized to speak for Sufism? So I could go on. There were a lot of other things I had hoped to talk about, but I think, I think so much good information, it's just impossible to do justice to all of these chapters. But these are a few of the things that I think both are covered in many of the chapters in the book, and that bear further exploration.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Next, we will move to Kathy, Professor Katherine Ewing, who is a professor of religion and director of the South Asia Institute at Columbia University. She, of course, is the author of the classic Arguing Sainthood, Modernity, Psychoanalysis, and Islam, published by Duke University Press, and most recently, the co-editor of the book that is under discussion, Modern Sufis and the State. Kathy, and then Rosemary, if you could take 10 minutes each, that would be useful, because then we'll have some time for questions also. And please don't mind in case I interrupt when you're done with your 10 minutes. Kathy, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I want to thank all of you for your thoughtful comments and insights. And I just wanted to say things all along the way and basically throw out what I was planning to say, because I knew that what I was planning to say would probably not be so relevant once we had already heard things from each of you. But I guess a couple of things I want to mention, be sure that are just kind of out there, is that this was a very complex, as Rosemary can attest, it was a very complex book to edit, because it has not only, I think, 12 contributors, but we also have commentaries on, it's divided into sections, and we have commentaries for each section by major scholars. So we have commentaries by Karl Ernst, Muhammad Qasim Zaman, SherAli, and Bruce Lawrence. So I just wanted to mention those because they might not necessarily get mentioned along the way, which gave a kind of a chance for reflection and bringing sort of core arguments out into conversation. But it was a lot of cats to herd, I have to say. I also wanted to mention, Kelly, you mentioned that you're working now in Senegal, and I too have done some work in basically Northwest Africa, Senegal, and Morocco, and more, and sort of some of the area in between, to think about how Sufism is being used today and changing, and how youth are, it kind of to pick up on that theme, I think, of the Sufi imaginary, how Sufism is being reimagined in these different settings, and very different, again, different political settings. So what's going on in Senegal is very different from what's going on in Mauritania or Morocco, where the political order is so different. So that was one of the things I found extremely sort of provocative to me as a scholar, thinking about the topic and trying to not just limit myself to my usual Pakistan, but also to encompass South Asia more broadly, was the very different political conditions in Pakistan and in India. And I think that really does come out in the different essays, because I think often people, even though we have, all of us working on Muslims in South Asia, there's often a gap between those working on Muslims or even Sufism in Pakistan versus those working on similar topics in India. And I think partly because the questions that are raised are different. So I think and this is something I say in the introduction, is that and something that I think Anand pointed out, or maybe it was you, SherAli, now I'm forgetting who said what, but that what you find out really has a lot to do with the questions you ask. And the book starts out by kind of faulting the question that was posed to me in initially being charged with organizing these workshops, which was, let's study Sufism and see how it can, contribute to peace in the world and that kind of thing. So it was recasting our core question as a group did feel a little bit like biting the hand that feeds us, in the sense that it did end up being quite a critique of the goals of the loose foundation in framing the project. Well, the thing is that it wasn't exactly the loose foundation that framed the project. It was people at Columbia who designed the initial project and did some wonderful work. I think this questioning, I think, really became possible sort of out of the springboard of the wonderful work that was done in the project. And I think, Anna, you were involved in some of it. But, sort of really thinking about the effects of this kind of research, became, and of a certain understanding of Sufism, of course, became the central springboard that we all took off from. But the question of even, is Sufism peaceful or not, that kind of thing, I think really shows, to me, and I think to anybody who knows anything about the details that we do encounter in the book, the question itself is at some level, or or is Sufism political, especially, and with the peace side associated with it? The question is, it would seem absurd if we weren't embedded within a particular global discourse today. That nobody would have asked that question in the same way, even 100 years ago. I don't think so. But then I think I don't want the sort of the impact of this collection to be that, oh yeah, we're just going to demolish all these models and demolish, sort of the projects that people are involved in when they get involved in promoting Sufism in one way or another. I think Kelly mentioned the idea of Sufi imaginaries, and maybe it wasn't the focal point of the way I framed the introduction, but maybe in other work I've done, there's been perhaps more emphasis on the sort of the imaginings. So, and given where people are now, how they're becoming engaged in Sufism and what they're doing with it. So it's not just people being political or resisting the political or that kind of thing, that there are sort of really active new ways that Sufism is involved in the world. And of course, it's inevitably shaped by these various currents that we're looking at. So the idea of Sufism as the peaceful Islam then gets taken up, not just by political actors that we're sort of concerned about, but also by, for example, young people. And it becomes a way of being Muslim or interacting with others in terms of new foundations. So, for example, the Pakistani government has, at some point, sort of organized Sufi meetings, but also concerts. And this is something that's happened in Morocco. This that Sufi music festival that I'm sure many of you have heard of and probably even been to in Fez. I actually interviewed the person who founded this whole festival thing, who's also an anthropologist, as it turns out, French Francophone anthropologist. And he said he was concerned about the kind of the way that the Sufism of his grandfather wasn't relevant to the young people that he was, he kind of went through college and all that stuff. I, trained in France and came back and it's like, this is my grandfather's Sufism, I love him and all, and he's a great Sufi leader, but I just think it's not going to speak to people today. So he had this idea to do this Sufi festival and took it to the king. The king thought it was a great idea and therefore, sort of dumped a lot of money in it, and we have this succession of festivals. Clearly, the king of Morocco, who has really been a major actor in thinking about sort of protecting Morocco from radical Islam through Sufism. I mean, that's one of his big agendas. On the other hand, he's really engaging young people in interesting new ways, often furtively, but it's becoming a much more open and public thing. And so I think sort of watching it play out differently and thinking beyond. I don't think we can think just of South Asia. We need to think beyond to the different ways that it does get played out in these different environments, and yet is also a global phenomenon. So Kelly, you mentioned the kind of the media and technology that you're thinking about, which is also something that I've been thinking about, and actually have an imminent frame piece on, I don't remember what it's called, but it focuses on Muinuddin Chishti, an encounter at the shrine, so in India, of an American-based sort of in Orthodox Sufi circles, a kind of controversial Naqshbandi figure who goes and meets one of the caretakers of the shrine, Ajmer, and there's a big meeting, and it's recorded on an iPhone, for the world to see. And so I kind of reflect on the ways that the media are being used to create these kind of new networks that have effects that we don't know, we can't predict. I mean, we need to sort of study what kinds of new sociality are being developed in these sort of Sufi environments, with very different kinds of interactions than occur in sort of more face-to-face Sufi settings. So I feel as though the book, in a way,
a couple more minutes and you can.
Oh, sorry, I'm talking, I guess. I feel as though the book, in a way, maybe is a way of kind of clearing the ground a little bit. Saying, okay, we really, Sufism is political. It's not antithetical to Islamic reform. It's changing all the time. It's not simply something that can be folklorized, as I think a very useful term here, but rather something that is growing and evolving, that the media interactions, people even in remote villages have cell phones or access to computers, and these become the ways that they interact with their peers, for example, that we have to and to just recognize that Sufis shrines are not necessarily, or even particularly, the sites of harmony and toleration, and that it's true that people of different backgrounds may come together at a shrine, they may come together in a marketplace, and that we need to think about the sort of the intentions, the political intentions of framing sites of Sufi practice in these ways, and to see how just how people come together in old ways and new ways, and I see that as our goal. Anyway, a few thoughts off the top of my head.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Our final panelist is the other editor of this volume, Professor Rosemary Corbett, who is a scholar of religion, race, and politics in US history and trained at Columbia University. She is the author of the excellent book, Making Moderate Islam, Sufism Service and the Ground Zero Mosque Controversy, published by Stanford University Press. She's worked at the Bard Prison Initiative for many years and is currently most active in working with the Center for Constitutional Rights, and of course, the co-editor of Modern Sufis and the State. Rosemary.
Thank you so much, everyone. First to Kathy for inviting me to co-edit this and be a co-organizer of that conference, from which I learned enormous amounts, because I am actually, by training, an Americanist who looks at the politics of Islam in the United States and the politics of American ideas about Islam, or foundational government ideas about Islam and their origins, as they ramify globally. So I feel this particular burden, first to thank all of you for participating today and your excellent commentary, but also to thank our participants in the volume who aren't reflected here, but had incredible contributions. But I feel just a bit of a burden to preface my remarks with just a quick schematic overview of the volume for people who have not read it yet. And it will speak to my intention also in being part of this project. As you know, as Kathy said, the grant was to come up with something which was not original, which was to to chart how Sufis could become the key to making modern democratic publics. This has been a question worked over by American intelligence agencies and American foundations, largely in cooperation with each other, for a very long time. It's also been a question utilized in a different way by British colonial administrators in various contexts. So coming into this, we didn't want to participate in that project. We wanted to disturb the assumptions inherent in that project. And my work actually for the last 20 years has been to look at these exercises and attempts of synthesizing Islam and modernity or Abrahamic politics or all of these things to see what their origins have been and what the politics have been, both top down and bottom up, who is involved, what they're articulating, where the money's coming from, where the influence is coming from. And one of the pivotal things in this, as the contributors have all spoken, is the dichotomy between Sufism and fundamentalism, which I have written extensively about where this idea comes from, how it gets interpolated into US statecraft, and how it is used to, as I say in the conclusion, depoliticize legitimate oppositional movements in various states, the US, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Palestinian territories, to then allow the state to reserve the exercise of violence for itself and to deploy it against oppositional movements that are conveniently just labeled as fundamentalist and likely to terrorize. So this was my question coming into this volume. And what the volume does is challenge several assumptions. First, that there is an opposition between Sufis and fundamentalists, and my contribution to this volume pulls out how very well-intentioned academics who were working in the specters of violence from World War I, World War II, and the partition of India and Palestine sought to incorporate Muslims into a global body politic by modernizing Muslim education. And they believed the key to modernizing Muslim education while keeping it still Islamic was to involve the influence of Sufis. This is because, pardon me for a moment. This is because they were extraordinarily reliant on a Hegelian reading of history, or even a Marxist reading of history for some of them who didn't want to just interpret the world, they wanted to change it, and operating with this extraordinary critique of secularism. They didn't want to be secular modernizers. They wanted to be, they believed that humanity would just continually commit extraordinary acts of violence if there was not some humane impulse injected into secular modernization. So that impulse was to come from religion, and for Muslims, it was to come from Sufism, which was the more artistic, humane, Aryan, as opposed to Semitic. These racial categories are very real and very crucial here, influence in Islamic history. So historical progress is necessary and inevitable. Everybody's going to modernize, and to save Muslims and the rest of the world from modernization with extraordinary violence or capitalist, for some of them, capitalist exploitation, we need an authentic Islam ready for the modern world and infused with a really deep commitment to humanity that they believe come from the flexibility of Aryans, not the legalism of Semites. Okay, so the volume challenges this notion that that Sufism and fundamentalism are oppositional. It challenges the notion that Sufism is a discrete and inherent category in itself. It challenges the idea that that reform and revivalism are necessarily antithetical. And then it brings us to the end with this question that I'm very pleased that Anand and Anna both picked up on this, about what our complicity is as scholars in these enterprises. And I say this because the foundation officers I looked at the Rockefeller Foundation, and full point of disclosure, I began working on this in 2004, this history, and in 2011, I met and fell in love with somebody whose family I didn't know, and it happened to be the Rockefeller family. And I called him and tried to break up with him the next day, saying, your grandfather was a friend of the Shah. I don't think we have anything to do with each other, but I'm not going to make my romantic history the subject of this. But I will say that I have continually since then questioned my complicity, how I, even as a student, my complicity, receiving funding, et cetera, et cetera. But we end the volume with this question of complicity. These were very well-intentioned academics and foundation officials who were bringing in Muslim scholars, particular Muslim scholars who were fluent in Hegel and Marx and believed in the dialectic of history that needed to synthesize Semitic legalism with Aryan flexibility in the context of modernization. And this was going to produce the perfect Muslim subject and the perfect Muslim polity to avoid further violent clashes between Muslim factions or between Muslim territories and non-Muslim territories. They were doing this out of almost desperation in the wake of the violence they'd seen. But of course, they were also doing this with an incredible hubris. And even though many of them were anti-imperialist, in fact, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, who received Rockefeller and Ford funding to create the Institute for Islamic Studies at McGill University, as I talked about, was extraordinarily anti-imperialist, believed that the revolution in, and Marxists believed that the revolution in India would end British imperialism. He and his funders recruited Muslims to this project because they believed that Muslims who were in power, some of them were former ministers of education, some of them went on to be future ministers of education in various regions, not just in South Asia, but also there was Ismail al-Farouqi, a Palestinian refugee who'd been the district governor of Galilee, and there was a Turkish student as well. They believed that these students could help deliberate over, but also come to the recognition of the need for this kind of synthesis of cultures and implicit synthesis of racial attitudes, and take that and export it to their countries and reform their countries to avoid future violence. Now, I will say, the scholars involved in this had their own agendas, every single one of them, from their own locales, etc. But they all had the hubris that they could both effect this kind of procedure, they could effect this kind of change. And that speaks to Anna's question about the impulse to put your finger on the scale. They were very hubristic in this sense, both in that they thought this was a formulaic exercise that could actually happen. And they thought that they could participate in US statecraft because often they were very involved with the CIA, with State Department, all sorts of things throughout this, often with the thought that they would not be co-opted by these forces, that they wouldn't be used by these forces. But they did this with incredible intentions to avert future violence and with hopes to bring Muslims into a situation independently, anti-imperially, so that they are not subject to neocolonialism and neo-imperialism. And in the process of this, they created this fundamentalist Sufi dichotomy that then was later taken up by other scholars and injected into political discourses through cooperation with the State Department and intelligence officials that becomes self-evident. And while the early scholars I talk about, Fazl Rahman, H.A.R. Gibb, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, believe that the dialectic between fundamentalists and Sufis, as they called them, was essential to producing progress in Muslim history. One force continually corrects the other. The scholars that they trained, who went on later to work with state departments and produce other analyses, such as the Fundamentalism Project, and Gibb and Smith and Rahman, to some extent themselves, created this category of fundamentalism, which is originally an American Protestant category that comes out of Protestant fights in the 1920s, used self-descriptively as people identify as fundamentalists. They project it onto Islam, and then they read it back into Islamic history. And in the process, they not only turn fundamentalism from a Protestant sect into a universal description, but they hide all of the political machinations, all the political dynamics, sometimes the imperialism, the colonialism, the anti-colonial militias that are giving voice to legitimate grievances under this rubric of fundamentalism. So that is what
Rosemary, sorry to be intervening, but maybe a minute more, and then so we have little time for questions. Thank
Sure. That is what my contribution to the volume, and I think the larger volume as a whole implicitly is arguing how these concepts that we create as scholars, even with incredible intentions, even with trying to push back on exercises of state violence by trying to dismantle the ways the state uses these religious categories in justification for violence, we're still complicit in a larger enterprise that we cannot control. And what is the position of the ethical scholar? What does that look like? What does that mean? And that's just, since we're at the end of the time, that's just a quick summary of the remarks I wanted to give, but I think that's a perfect question to end on, frankly. And thank you all once again for participating in this and for all of your brilliant work on the subject. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosemary. So we actually have 6 minutes left. We'll have more of a rapid fire Q&A here. I was so engrossed in all the brilliant commentaries from all our panelists that I guess I didn't keep a check on time as well as I should have. But what I'll do is I'll combine a couple of questions that I think speak perhaps most clearly, and with my apologies to people whose questions I will not be able to get a chance to get to. I'll combine a couple of questions. One comes from Ishani Gupta, who's also working in her dissertation on these topics, and she raises an interesting question that I will paraphrase, which is, what do we do with those moments when this whole framing of Sufism as the antidote to fundamentalism, radicalism, is in fact embraced by Sufis, individuals and groups themselves? And she gives the example of, Chishtis at Ajmer Sharif, and she talks about this intriguing phenomenon that the All India Sufi Sajada Nashin Council recently is in talks with national security advisors, other government representatives. So what do we do with that kind of an ambiguous moment? The other question by Hafsa Kanjwal at Lafayette College, and she continues to have us interrogate a bit more this whole question of how do we push back against the flawed contours of the various foundations, given how so much of our scholarship has to be legible to them in order to get funded, supported, etc. What do we do when these foundations are in so many cases directly involved in imperialist and violent projects? So anyone in the panel, I'll just, with those two questions, perhaps.
I might say something quickly about the first question, which is, I think that's really, in my ramblings, I was trying to address to some extent, is we need to look at what, not just sort of criticize the gaze of the foundation or these governments, but recognize that people who are embracing Sufism are doing it in complex and multiple ways, and that we need to see, to understand that, and that this embrace may well involve. I think one of the big concerns for people is not being relegated to the archaic. That the Sufi who embraces government or doesn't is a fully modern participant in the world. And I think that's been one of the real problems of scholarship, has been that it sometimes forgets that.
If I might, sorry to jump in. If I might respond to Aishani's question very quickly, I think it's very interesting what's happening in contemporary India, where of course you have people who are, willing participants in things like the World Sufi Council. But even among people at the Nizamuddin Dargah in Delhi who are Chishtis, there are both kinds of. There are people who are among the Khadims who have been in support of it, because they do want to. For various complex reasons, but there are also people who are pushing back against this and did not participate in these things. One of the interesting results of there being no good Muslims left in Indian public discourse, and I think it's important to think of how even Muinuddin Chishti of Ajmer is being vilified in contemporary Hindutva discourse of the kind that circulates on WhatsApp groups. One of the interesting consequences of there being no good Muslims left in Indian public discourse is that various kinds of Muslims, including Sufis, shrine-based Sufis, Barelvis and Deobandis, and Shias, who've often been at loggerheads, are actually finding reasons to come together. with very kind of innovative ways of, like, for example, Shias and Sunnis praying together for Eid namaz. So yeah, all of this to say that things are complicated. And yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. As to the question of funding, I think for me, what you've done in this volume, Kathy and Rosemary, is really important. I don't know if how to say more than that. Hafsa's question. So I think it does show us a way that you can kind of work through these complexities.
Well, I think, can I just add something to that, which is, I think one of the goals was to like instruct maybe the loose foundation that, yes, there's a way of questioning without, you know, destroying your goals by refine, you know, seeing it as a matter of refining goals rather than just disrupting them completely. As I think they're, you know, well, and I've talked to donors, if, you know, from this end of the career, you end up talking with, you know, donors who fund institutes and things like that. And, you know, the intentions are often good, but the ways that they imagine their good intentions being realized are flawed. And our goal is to educate.
The doctrine of double effect is very much in operation here.
Okay, maybe we'll just take one final question and we'll end maybe at 7:05. We'll just take at most. And the other
I just want to interject, SherAli, that I didn't mean to say we're dismantling the loose foundation's objectives, although I think for some of us that was certainly in consideration, but we were dismantling the assumptions on which the question was asked.
Yeah.
So I'll just reformulate a question that came from Aishwarya Thakur. And that question has to do with about this popular sort of narrative about Sufis as Islamic missionaries who attracted local populations and then played an important part in the Islamization of South Asia. How does this volume sort of I'm reformulating the question. How does this volume challenge that narrative, etc., or could challenge that kind of narrative, or the category of syncretism as syncretistic, etc.?
If I could just say something quickly about that, I don't see that it directly challenges that narrative, but maybe implicitly so. I mean, you know, the idea of Sufis deliberately going out and converting sometimes whole, you know, villages at a time to Islam is a very old and popular trope. It certainly has made its way into the narrative tales that you find in many places around the world, right? In communities around the world. I think that, you know, there were several chapters that demonstrated the appeal that Sufis have to local populations, and that gives us an in for understanding some of the ways in which people become attached to individual Sufis, Sufi families, and Sufi institutions, right? For example, there were a couple of chapters, and I'm sorry, I'm not remembering which ones off the top of my head dealt directly with this, but that discussed the ways in which individual Sufis act as local mediators, right? So between ordinary people and, you know, for example, the district magistrate or the local police. I'm just, you know, pulling a couple of potential stakeholders out of my hat here. But especially where individual Sufis or Sufi families are social as well as spiritual elites, right? They have a lot of pull in villages. So people don't just look to them, obviously, for spiritual guidance, but in patronage-based societies, right, you need to have these kinds of connections to get sometimes even basic things done. Sufis are one kind of connection within that landscape, you know, within that patronage landscape. So I think that there are several chapters that kind of lend themselves to us understanding mission or missionary activity in this rather more expanded sense, instead of understanding it simply as someone going out and explicitly trying to convert people to a religion. Because honestly, there's really nothing in the literature of Sufism that suggests that that was really a goal.
Thank you for that, Kelly. I'd also like to say that I think the participants in the volume who wrote on aspects that you touched on were mostly united in the goal of showing that Sufi is not a coherent unitary category either, and that there are many different positionalities and traditions and all sorts of things involved and grouped together in this category that's been made for the utilization of Orientalists and later political figures, but that it is, the things grouped under Sufism are extremely wide and varied, and that these things have to be looked at in their local contexts.
So we have come to the end of our time here. Let me acknowledge quite a few of the authors are part of the audience here. So I just want to acknowledge their presence. Thank you for joining and for your wonderful contributions. Let me thank, of course, Kathy and Rosemary for producing the splendid volume that became fodder for our fascinating discussion today. And of course, to Anand, Anna, and Kelly for the really brilliant commentaries. So the text is Modern Sufis and the State, The Politics of Islam in South Asia and Beyond, published by Columbia University Press 2020. Read it, buy it, teach it, paperback, wonderful volume. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for your really insightful thoughts. And SherAli for keeping track of us all.
Thank you, everyone.